The year is 1872. You are miles deep into the great Osage Trail, a vein of dirt and desperation cutting through the bleeding heart of Kansas. The wind out here doesn't just blow, it scours. It stings your eyes with grit and chaps your lips until they bleed. Your horse is spent, your throat is parched. All you want is a hot meal and a place to rest your head away from the unending, maddening prairie horizon. You spot a small, rough-hewn structure just off the road. A sign promises groceries and meals. You step inside and the sensory assault is immediate. The air is thick, hanging heavy with the smell of stale coffee, grease, and the pungent musk of unwashed wool. It's cramped, but the warmth of the stove draws you in like a moth to a flame. But there is a coldness here, too. It radiates from the older woman watching you from the corner, Ma Bender. Her eyes don't greet you, they assess you. They weigh the gold in your pockets against the burden of your existence. Despite the unease crawling up your spine, hunger wins. You ask for a meal. They guide you with strange, hurried hospitality to the place of honor. It's the special table, positioned oddly at the back of the room. You sit down, the wood hard beneath you. Your back is pressed almost flush against a heavy canvas wagon sheet that divides the small cabin in two. It's a strange partition, stained and thick, hiding the sleeping quarters from view. You relax just for a moment. You raise the tin cup of bitter coffee to your lips, the steam fogging your vision. That's when you hear it. A subtle shift in the air pressure. A soft, deliberate rustle of fabric directly behind your head. Someone is standing there inches away, separated only by that thin veil of canvas. You don't have time to turn around. You don't have time to scream. Because here, hospitality is a trap, and what comes next is worse than you imagine. We have been force-fed a sanitized mythology of the American West. Pop culture paints the 1870s frontier as a landscape of noble struggle, community barn raisings, and golden sunsets over the prairie. We imagine a world where neighbors help neighbors and justice always prevails. But this is a complete fabrication. The reality was a desolate, lawless void. It was an anonymous hunting ground where morality dissolved the moment you stepped off the civilized path. In the 1870s, thousands of travelers simply evaporated into the Kansas tallgrass. When a son stopped writing letters home, or a father never returned with his fortune, their families didn't assume foul play. They assumed they had simply moved on, pushed further west to California, reinvented themselves, or failed silently. This assumption was a gift to predators. These travelers weren't just missing, they were being harvested. The isolation of the Osage Trail meant that a scream could travel for miles and never find a human ear. This brings us to the Benders themselves. It is a critical mistake to view them as desperate outlaws or star-crossed bandits robbing stagecoaches for survival. That gives them too much credit. They were something far colder. They were serial capitalists. They didn't hunt you down, they invited you in. They were running a highly efficient slaughterhouse disguised as a grocery store, turning hospitality into an industry. If you want the history textbooks are too afraid to print, subscribe now. Because the truth is always bloodier than the legend. To understand how a slaughter of this magnitude continues uninterrupted for years, you first have to understand the geography of silence. The Bender claim sat in Labette County, Kansas, positioned with surgical precision right on the Osage Mission Trail. This wasn't a community, it was a vacuum. The land here stretches out in an endless flat purgatory where the wind swallows sound. If a man screamed in the Bender cabin, the only thing that would hear him was the prairie grass. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and on the frontier, asking questions about strange noises was a good way to shorten your life expectancy. But the location was only the stage. The actors were far more disturbing. The Bloody Benders, as history would brand them, were a family unit that seemed to operate as a single, predatory organism. At the head was John Bender Sr., a 60-year-old brute with hollow eyes and a jaw set in permanent disdain. He spoke little English, communicating mostly in grunts and German curses. Then there was Ma Bender, the matron. She wasn't the nurturing mother figure of Western law. She was cold, calculating, and arguably the true mastermind behind the operation. She didn't cook meals, she managed the inventory. The children were even more unsettling. John Jr. was a grown man in his mid-20s, but possessed the mind of a chaotic child. He was known around the county for his sudden, inappropriate laughter, a giggling oddity who would stare a little too long at things that shouldn't be stared at. But the linchpin, the one who made the trap work, was Kate. Kate Bender was the siren. She was young, attractive, and intelligent, speaking fluent English with almost no accent. In a land starved for female companionship, she was a beacon. But Kate had a hook sharper than just her beauty. She capitalized on the spiritualist craze sweeping the nation. She marketed herself as Professor Miss Katie Bender, a psychic healer and medium who could speak to the dead and cure ailments. She distributed handbills advertising her supernatural abilities, drawing in the lonely, the sick, and the gullible. She used spiritualism to disarm travelers, creating an atmosphere of mysticism that masked the smell of blood. The Benders understood the economy of the era perfectly. In 1872, you didn't wire money, you carried it. Men traveling the Osage Trail were often moving their entire lives. They had liquidated their farms back east, sewn their life savings into heavy leather cash belts, and strapped them under their shirts. Every weary traveler walking through that door wasn't just a guest, they were a walking bank vault. The Benders knew that if you hit the vault hard enough with a hammer, it would crack open. Kate would lure them in with promises of a hot meal or a seance. John Jr. and Sr. would wait behind the curtain, and Ma would watch the road. It was a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of death. When investigators eventually pried apart the Bender legacy, they found that the horror wasn't just in the act of killing, but in the industrial design of the cabin itself. Most serial killers are opportunists. They strike when the moment presents itself. The Benders were engineers. Their home was not a shelter. It was a machine built for a singular purpose. The structure was a crude, one-room shanty, measuring roughly 16 by 24 feet. But the genius of the trap lay in the interior design. A heavy, stained canvas wagon sheet was strung across the width of the room, dividing the space into two distinct zones. The front was the public face, the grocery store, the dining area, the facade of civilization. The back was the abattoir, the living quarters, and the staging ground for violence. That piece of fabric was the only thing separating the victim from the executioner, and it was the most critical component of their system. The protocol was rigid. It never varied because it never failed. When a traveler with sufficient means entered, they were not just seated anywhere. They were guided specifically to the guest of honor seat at the special table. This chair was positioned with its back directly against the canvas divider. It forced the guest to sit with their head inches away from the concealed darkness of the rear chamber. It turned the back of their skull into a stationary target. This is where Kate's role shifted from hostess to handler. She would sit across from the traveler, engaging them in intense conversation. If the victim was a man seeking spiritual guidance, she would trance him. If he was simply a lonely traveler, she would use her charm. Her goal was kinetic. She needed the victim to lean forward. She needed them to relax their posture, exposing the base of the neck and the back of the cranium against the fabric. She was the lure that ensured the prey looked forward, while the threat materialized behind. The violence that followed was brutally percussive. Waiting behind the curtain were the male Benders, armed with tools that suggest a terrifying pragmatism. They didn't use guns, which were loud and messy. They didn't use knives, which required a struggle. They used hammers. Investigators later recovered two distinct sledgehammers from the property, hidden behind that curtain. One was a smaller shoe hammer, light and fast. The other was a massive sledgehammer, heavy and final. The mechanics were simple. At a signal from Kate, the canvas would bulge. The smaller hammer would strike first, a precise blow through the fabric to the back of the head designed to stun the victim instantly. No scream, no fight, just the sudden shutting down of the nervous system. Once the body slumped, the canvas was pulled back, and the massive sledgehammer was used to crush the skull, ensuring death was absolute. It was a slaughterhouse assembly line, efficient and silent, turning a human being into cargo in less than 3 seconds. The blow from the sledgehammer is not a warning, it is a catastrophic structural failure of the human form. When that massive iron head strikes the canvas, transferring kinetic energy directly into the back of the skull, the result is horrific. Forensic analysis of the victims recovered from the Bender property tells a consistent, brutal story. The impact almost always shatters the right parietal or temporal bone. The skull doesn't just crack, it caves in. Bone fragments are driven inward, lacerating the dura mater and the brain tissue beneath. For the victim, the world doesn't fade to black, it simply ceases to exist in a flash of white-hot pressure. But the Benders are not taking chances. They are not interested in comas, they are interested in corpses. While the victim is still slumped forward, nerves firing in chaotic spasms, the second phase of the protocol begins immediately. One of the men grabs the body, dragging it backward through the curtain to get it off the guest room floor. Then the knife comes out. With the efficiency of butchers dressing a hog, they draw the blade across the throat, severing the carotid arteries and the windpipe in a single motion. It is a wet, gurgling finish, designed to ensure that no one ever stands up again. Or at least, that is the plan. But this is where the story shifts from simple murder to something chemically pure in its nightmare fuel. This is the answer to why you clicked on this video. In the center of the floor, hidden beneath a bed or a table in the rear living quarters, lies a trapdoor. It is the mouth of the beast. Once the throat is cut, the Benders do not waste time cleaning the body or prepping it for burial immediately. They simply lift the hatch and shove the victim into the void beneath the house to bleed out in the dark. Gravity takes the evidence away, allowing them to reset the table for the next traveler. However, forensic evidence suggests a reality that is far worse than instant death. A sledgehammer to the skull is devastating, yes, but it is a blunt instrument. It is messy. Depending on the angle of the strike or the thickness of the skull, the blow might not kill instantly. It might only paralyze or render the victim unconscious. And the throat cut. If the blade misses the major arteries and only severs the windpipe, a human being can survive for minutes, drowning in their own blood. This means that not every body dropped through that trapdoor was a corpse. Imagine the physics of that horror. You take a hammer to the head, you feel the sting of the knife, then you fall. You land in the cold, wet darkness of a stone-lined pit, 6 feet deep. You are unable to move, your body broken, lying atop a pile of other travelers who came before you, and you are still awake, you are still breathing. When the lawmen eventually pried open that trapdoor months later, they were physically repulsed by what rose up to meet them. It wasn't just the smell of decay, it was a physical weight in the air. One witness described it as the breath of hell. The floor of the cellar was not dirt, it was a sludge of congealed black blood. The earth was so saturated with the fluids of dozens of victims that the soil had turned into a foul, iron-rich mud that went inches deep. The Benders didn't just kill people, they stored them like livestock in a larder. The cellar was a holding tank for the dead and the dying. The screams that the prairie wind swallowed above ground were nothing compared to the silence of the men and women bleeding out in the dark beneath the floorboards, listening to the Benders eat their dinner just a few feet above their heads. Predators thrive on anonymity. For years, the Benders survived because they targeted the forgotten, drifters, lone prospectors, and men whose disappearances could be explained away by the harshness of the frontier. But in the spring of 1873, arrogance finally eclipsed their caution. They made a fatal error. They didn't target a nobody. They targeted a man whose absence would shake the foundations of Kansas. Enter Dr. William York. York is not a desperate traveler counting pennies. He is a man of substance, a wealthy physician, and a member of the Kansas legislature. Even more dangerous for the Benders, he has powerful brothers, one of whom is Colonel Ed York. When William steps through the door of the Bender Inn, he isn't looking for a meal, he is looking for answers. The narrative here drips with a suffocating irony. Dr. York is traveling the trail specifically to investigate the disappearance of a neighbor, George Lonker, and his infant daughter, who vanished on this very road months prior. York stands in the cramped, grease-stained room and looks Ma Bender in the eye. He asks the very people who slaughtered his friends if they have seen them. He is standing on top of their grave while asking for their whereabouts. The Benders, cool as ice, deny everything. They likely offer their sympathies. The trail is dangerous, they say. People move on. They invite the good doctor to sit. They offer him the hospitality that has become their trademark. And because York is a civilized man in an uncivilized place, he accepts. Reconstruct the final minutes. It is a scene of domestic terror. York takes the guest of honor seat. He is tired from the search, perhaps grateful for the warmth of the stove. He unbuttons his coat, relaxing against the partition. Behind him, the canvas sheet hangs still. Kate sits across from him, perhaps asking about his medical practice or his search efforts, her voice steady and hypnotic. She holds his gaze. She ensures he is leaning in, engaged, distracted. He never hears the rustle behind him. He never sees the hammer. The man who came to find the dead becomes one of them. But William York does not fade away. When he fails to return home, his brother, Colonel York, launches a manhunt that tears through Labette County like a storm. He brings men, he brings guns, and he brings questions that the Benders cannot answer. When the law finally descends on the property and the spades hit the earth in the apple orchard, they find him. Dr. York is pulled from a shallow grave, his body telling the now familiar story. The skull is crushed on the right side. The throat is cut from ear to ear. His discovery breaks the spell. The anonymous horror of the Osage Trail finally has a face, and that face demands justice. When the hammer finally drops on the investigation, it hits nothing but air. By the time Colonel York and the neighbors return with a warrant and a grim resolve, the cabin is silent. The livestock are starving in the yard. The wagon is gone. The Benders do not panic, they simply evaporate. They sense the closing net and dissolved into the night, abandoning their home, their possessions, and their secrets. The silence they left behind is quickly replaced by the sounds of excavation. The posse breaks down the door and pries open the trapdoor, recoiling from the stench rising from the blood-soaked cellar. But the true horror isn't inside the house, it is in the garden. The men take iron rods and begin probing the ground in the apple orchard behind the cabin. Every few feet, the rod strikes something soft. They call it Hell's Half-Acre. As the spades turn the earth, the Benders' harvest is revealed. They pull bodies from the ground like twisted roots. One by one, the missing travelers return to the light, mutilated, crushed, and decaying. In total, 11 bodies are recovered from the loose soil. The most heart-wrenching discovery is that of the young girl, little Alice Lonker. Found buried beneath her father, the evidence suggests she wasn't killed by the hammer. She was likely thrown into the hole while still alive, suffocating in the cold earth beneath the weight of her father's corpse. And yet, for all this carnage, there is no execution. The Benders are never officially caught. The trail goes cold. One theory offers a grim satisfaction, that a vigilante posse caught them on the road, executed them, and swore a pact of silence to protect the community. But a darker theory persists. Reports surface for decades of a strange family operating in Colorado or Texas. the possibility remains that they didn't pay for their crimes. They simply moved the slaughterhouse to a new town, leaving us with 11 graves and a century of nightmares. The most terrifying lesson of the Bender family isn't found in the autopsy reports or the depths of the blood-soaked cellar, it is found in their camouflage. We are conditioned to believe that evil is ugly, that danger has a warning sign, but the Benders proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like a struggling immigrant family offering you a warm cup of coffee on a cold night. They proved that the most dangerous place in the West wasn't the open wilderness, but the parlor of a civilized home. This is the dark distinction of our species. In the animal kingdom, predators hunt for survival, targeting other species. Humans are the only creatures on Earth that engineer complex, industrial traps for their own kind. We don't just kill, we automate the process. The Benders were not an anomaly, they were a mirror, showing us exactly what human beings are capable of when the thin veneer of society is stripped away by the isolation of the frontier. History is written by the victors, but the dead tell the truth. If you want to hear them speak, like this video and subscribe to Crimson Historians.